May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. I've just watched the Prime Minister's news conference and the interrogation that followed it. I wish they wouldn't encourage journalists to ask these questions, which generally boil down to, why did you get it so wrong, or why have you had the audacity to change your mind? At least nowadays no one bothers anymore with, when are we going to get back to normal? That one's like, how long is a piece of string? Everyone has a different answer, each one entirely implausible. Well, believe it or not, this resonates with our readings today. The Gospel. For 700 years, the life of the Jewish people was chaos. They dreamed of a return to their golden age when they lived at peace in their promised land under the gentle rule of their shepherd king, David. That was actually an incredibly brief period of prosperity. Before the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, one by one invaded the Holy Land and churned it all up, on 2 separate occasions even taking the people away into exile. We saw last week how on one occasion, during that period, just one brief occasion, when they were about to be led back from their captivity in Babylon, how for just one moment they grasped a vision of righteousness and peace. It seemed as if it just might be there within their reach. Peace, joy and prosperity. And for just a little moment they thought that might actually happen. And yet, here we still are, in this morning's Gospel, the angel Gabriel talking to the Blessed Virgin Mary, rekindling the hope that even now things might turn out better. Hope. I say that hope is astonishing. It stretched back, it was kept alive for 1,000 years, as if we in our time were still hoping to reverse the Norman conquest. How did they keep the vision alive for so long? Well, it was the prophets who tended the flame. And we see it in Mary. Mary isn't normally described as a prophet, but think of the Magnificat. He hath exalted the humble and meek, the rich he hath sent empty away. Throughout Scripture, this is the recurring theme of the prophets. An end to oppression, protect the poor. Scripture never attacks the rich for being wealthy. Being well off is a sign of God's favour as far as the Old Testament in particular is concerned. But what they could not stand, what they would not stand for, was the rich taking advantage of the poor, oppressing them. It's too easy to predict the economic effect of the pandemic. You know as much as I do how it's likely to turn out. There are trends of protest emerging, and at first sight they do seem to have a point. According to the Times, during the lockdown in the spring, the world's billionaires saw their wealth rise by 27%. Such disparity of wealth. At first sight, certainly, you feel something got to be done about that. And I'm sure that nice Mr. Sunak is making his plans. But imagine you feel aggrieved by this and you decide to make an example of a billionaire. Let's say Mr. Bezos of Amazon. Let's confiscate from Mr. Bezos £1 billion. Let's confiscate from him £1 billion that is gained from Amazon's tax avoidance. Strip him of £1,000 million and distribute it equally amongst the population of the UK. We'd be rich. Well, it would net us each the princely sum of £15. It wouldn't go very far, just enough to fund your next purchase from Amazon. So give it 10 days or so, and that £1 billion will be back precisely where it came from. I could make this a lovely long sermon, but I don't need to. I think you can make it up for yourself. The essential question I want to ask is this. All these visions of the prophets, all these visions that churches come up with nowadays when their bishops encourage them to manufacture vision statements, all entirely unrealistic. Not one of them likely to usher in an era of wolf flying down with the lamb, the lion eating straw like the ox. These utopian ideas simply don't materialize. They never will. Or if they do, people may try to impose them by force. And it will all go horribly pear-shaped. What do? Do we just give up? Reconcile ourselves, as eventually the Jews did, reconcile ourselves to the idea that we'll only regain the peace and joy of the Garden of Eden in some far imagined future that may never happen, perhaps even one that's only accessible in a different life? The answer to that certainly has to be no. And I'll give you the briefest, concisest possible answer to what we need to do instead. This really is going to be brief. It's an agenda for a year's preaching, which you may or may not get from me. It's brief, and I shall say it only once. 3 groups of 3. Firstly, Scripture, Sacrament, and Service. Scripture, Sacrament, and Service. 3 fundamental pillars of the Church. We need to take Scripture far more seriously. Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest it. We need to value the sacraments more highly, cherish a stronger view of the transforming effects they have on people's lives. As for service, yes, we do a lot of that already. The people of St. Sulhamstead, St. Mary's are wonderful at it. But the next stage might be, perhaps first, to be more ready to allow others to serve us. People can't serve unless service is permitted. And secondly, to regard service as a duty, rather than as a favour we do someone. We shouldn't expect necessarily to be thanked. Perhaps even, and I know this will be unpopular amongst this congregation, perhaps even say thank you a little less often. Not as if you're taking service for granted, but to acknowledge that ultimately it's not actually you that's being served. In serving others, we're not so much serving each other as obeying the Lord, and it's the Lord who will decide whether, as servants, we're good and faithful or unprofitable. Sometimes a measure of how good a servant we are may be how much we hate doing the task we've been given, and how we still feel good about it, even if our service doesn't seem to have been valued. The second group of 3, as a church and as individuals, we need to keep our eyes fixed on 3 focuses. First, what we see as the church's ultimate aims and how we can be contributing to these. Secondly, how content are we with the ethical dimension of our own lives? And thirdly, how should all this feed into social or charitable action? An audit of these things within our own lives and also within the church. And lastly, worship, prayer, and gratitude. We need to learn to meditate and pray on the fruits of the Spirit listed by St. Paul, which you find so conveniently listed in Galatians 5:22. In worship, we need to expect to encounter God in worship. Not just turn up with low expectations of our time together in church and conceal our disappointment by resorting to happy chatter. And finally, we should reflect on how beautiful the cosmos is, how full of endless ingenuity to make life in abundance possible for us, and how we should show our gratitude in many ways, but in particular by leaving it in as good a shape as we found it. There. I said I'd be concise. It was all over before you even noticed. There's nothing new there. It's what you've known the Christian life required of us from our mother's knee. The yoke is easy, the burden light, especially since the world in which we live and move deep down knows what we say and do is true. Chaos, malice, indifference, and unkindness may assail us, may cloud the vision, may seem to make it impossible to achieve. Certainly, Mary would find this during her life, when, as Simeon predicted, the sword pierced her heart. Life was difficult for her, life was difficult for her son. It might have all seemed to be a great failure. And yet she talked of it in terms of the Lord having done great things for her. The privilege of serving the kingdom. As I say, chaos, malice, indifference and unkindness will come our way as we strive towards this vision, which does all the time seem unachievable. It may or it may not be, but we can say, with heads held high, we're on the way. We can say, we're on the way, we're on the good old way that the world has known is good since it learned what goodness was. We're on the way, and there are hundreds of millions of us, all on the way together.